Jewish nationals here in this country. We have a very important trading relationship with Israel, but the cooperation on intelligence, military and security is essential, not just to our national interests, but to the global security of much of the world. And so I've made this decision with regret. It's in sorrow, not in anger. And he will understand that others, in fact conservative governments, have gone for a full arms embargo. We have not done that today because we recognise with Hezbollah, with the Houthis, with Hamas, it is right that Israel has the means to defend itself.
Emily Thornbury.
Mr. Speaker, could my right honourable friend just reiterate the very important point, which is this is not an arms embargo on Israel. We continue to support Israel's right to defend itself and will continue to sell it arms, but that the rules underpinning our control of arms are as they have always been, which is that the UK will not permit the sale of arms if they might be used for internal repression or international aggression. And for that reason, we have cut the number of arms export licences by 30.
Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend spent a few more years at the bar than I did. And she knows that in making this very sober assessment, it is based, Mr. Speaker, on a clear risk. And on the basis of that clear risk, it is arms and weaponry that may be used in Gaza that we have sought, and it amounts to around 30 that we have sought to suspend. It's of course our sincere hope that we get to that ceasefire and the sustained position that will allow us, of course, to resume working in the way that we would normally work with our Israeli friends.
Baltos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too met the mother of Hirsch Goldberg Polin in Jerusalem, and it's a terrible tragedy that his name has joined the list of many thousands of innocents who've died in this conflict over the last few months on both sides. Now, the Secretary of State will know that I've been long concerned about the situation in the West Bank, and I understand that the measures he's taken today, and indeed sanctions generally, are not purely performative. He wants them to have some bite. So I wanted to ask you about the case of Hilltop Youth today. This organisation, violent settler organisation, was sanctioned by the previous government earlier this year and was recently described as a bunch of terrorists by the head of the Internal Security Service in Israel. And yet our sanctions seemingly have had no impact on their behaviour or their conduct and the violent persecution that they're visiting upon innocent Palestinians in the West Bank. So will he consider extending our sanctions to those who support and sustain this organisation and others, both within Israel and externally? Because if we're going to be taken seriously on an international stage, whether it's in Iran, in the case of Iran, or these violent organisations, our measures have to have bite and effect, and at the moment, seemingly, they aren't.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the right honourable gentleman who has raised these issues consistently in this House now over many years is absolutely right to draw focus to what is happening on the West Bank. And that is not because of the immediate violence that we've seen over the last 2 days. It's because the level of violence, the expansion, the sense of impunity that one sees when one is in the West Bank is of huge concern. Can I reassure him that I continue to work with allies and I continue to keep these matters under close review?
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. I speak as a long-term friend of Palestine and an advocate of a two-state solution. I'm sure he'll agree with me when it comes to the release of hostages. We want to see all hostages released in their hundreds and thousands. But I'd ask him particularly what assessment he's made of the impact of his suspension of 30 of these licences, because Israel has shown little sign of responding to pressure from the outside world. And along with the Oxford and Abingdon, what further steps is he prepared to take? Because we see in the West Bank these egregious behaviours, and is it really conscionable that Israel going to respond in a favourable way to the limited but welcome announcement that he's made today?
Foreign Secretary.
What can I say to my honourable friend? I know the strength with which he talks about these issues and has talked consistently about them over many, many years. Let me just make clear that the announcement, Mr. Speaker, that I make today follows a process. It's a process that was set up by the last government in 2021. We have followed that process to the law, and that is why I'm here today. It is in no way to punish Israel. That is not the point of the process. It is to make sure that our export licensing regime remains amongst the very robust in the world. And I recognise what he says about the West Bank particularly, and it's why I went to the region just a few weeks ago once again.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for prior sight of the statement. And of course, we welcome anything which reduces the appalling death toll in Gaza and increasingly, sadly, in the West Bank. But this statement raises so many questions which I will write to the Foreign Secretary about later. But could I press him on the issue of the UK recognising that the Netanyahu government's use of UK weapons poses a clear risk of the violation of international humanitarian law? You'll be aware that there is no legal definition between what is an offensive weapon and what is a defensive weapon. So why and on what basis, if there is, in his words, a clear risk of the violation of international humanitarian law, why has he not imposed a blanket ban on Israel until that risk has gone away completely?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that we have one of the most robust export licensing regimes in the world. The process requires us to make an assessment about the clear risk in the theatre of conflict. And the theatre of conflict in relation to this is Gaza. And therefore we have made an assessment on the basis of the licences that could be used in Gaza, and I've made the announcement that I've made today. But I think that the honourable gentleman, in the thrust of his remarks, notwithstanding the concerns around international humanitarian law in that theatre of action, should recognise the real threats that Israel faces from Lebanese Hezbollah, should recognise what the Houthis are doing now in the Red Sea, and recently we saw this terrible attack on a Greek oil tanker just over the last few days, and recognise the long-standing relationship that this country has with Israel, and particularly in relation to intelligence and military accession that keeps much of the Middle East and the world safe. And it's for that basis that my remarks are measured, and I defend that.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Foreign Secretary's decision to suspend certain arms sales to Israel. I also appreciate his acknowledgement that Israel could do much more to allow aid to reach people in Gaza. I'd like to ask the Foreign Secretary what further conversations he's had with the Israeli government to ask them to ensure that aid workers are able to do their vital work safely and effectively, and that aid can get to those who desperately need it.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that the issue of aid workers and the tremendous loss of life of aid workers in this conflict is an issue I have raised directly in all of my meetings with the Israeli government. And there's another issue that sits alongside this, and it's the issue of deconfliction. It must be the case that in any war there are rules. And one of the rules are that aid workers are able to get medical supplies and aid to the civilians that need it. And there have been real issues with deconfliction zones and the amount of aid workers who've died and the amount of UN workers who've died in this conflict. She's absolutely right to raise it.
Sammy Wilson.
Madam Speaker. The only people who will be overjoyed by this decision today will be the Hamas terrorists who murdered in cold blood 6 hostages at the weekend. They have been handed a line of hope that this government will not stand firm in its defence of Israel's right to defend itself. And let's look at the threadbare arguments that the Minister has used today, that these arms might be used to breach international humanitarian law. And yet he admits that the government cannot arbitrate as to whether or not Israel has done so to date, that civilian deaths have been caused. And yet, hardly a couple of paragraphs later in this statement, the Minister states that the civilian deaths have been a result of Hamas embedding itself in the civilian population with no regard for those people who have been affected. And the last reason he gives then is that Israel is responsible for these deaths, even though he again admits that it is not possible to determine who is responsible for these deaths, and indeed how many deaths there have been. We rely on Hamas propaganda in most cases for that. I would say to the Minister today that this is a bad decision. It is a decision which we will come to live to regret, and it's one which, unfortunately, I believe has been a result, maybe a lot of the pressure which Labour MPs have found in their seats as a result of Gaza protests.
Trey.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that this party supported British fighters taking to the skies in defence of Israel when missiles were being delivered from Iran. We did that on April the 13th. This party supported the last government in their defence of Israel following the attacks we've seen from the Houthis in the Red Sea. And I would also remind him that I have not gone as far today as Margaret Thatcher went in 1982. Governments of both types, Vince Cable, Liberal Democrat, Gordon Brown, have had to make these difficult decisions. And I stand by both a party and, I hope, at a chamber that recognises the importance of international humanitarian law and the clear risk assessment that we have been required to make sure that we are not in breach of that as a country.
Chion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the government's decision to suspend certain arms licences to Israel. My constituents are horrified by the unimaginable and unacceptable suffering in Gaza and certainly would not want any British exports to contribute to it. And my constituents are also horrified by the unimaginable and unacceptable suffering of the hostages held for over 11 months now, to many of whom who have been killed. Now, the Foreign Secretary will have seen the protests in Tel Aviv last night, and the strikes called by Israeli labour unions to try to persuade the Israeli government to strike a deal and bring the hostages home. From his discussions with the Israeli government, what does he see as the main obstacles to a deal which brings the hostages home and which delivers a ceasefire in Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend asks a very good question, and Madam Deputy Speaker, she's absolutely right. What brings this to an end is a ceasefire. And the issues really boil down to the security of Israel once we get to that ceasefire. And she will have read, no doubt, the issues around the Philadelphia corridor particularly, and the ability or Israel's insistence at this stage that they should be present still in Gaza, and that being a matter of discussion. There have been previously also issues around not just the hostages that must come out, and she's absolutely right, those hostages must come out, but also the prisoners that it's hoped would leave Israel's prisoners as well, the Palestinian prisoners particularly. But the truth of this is that we are now reaching a decisive point, as Joe Biden has said. We can get there, and we need to get there. to bring to an end this horror that's now gone on for many, 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 many months.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary will be very well aware of the decisions made by the ICJ and the ICC. He'll also be very well aware that the world has condemned Israel for its illegal occupation of the West Bank, the settlement policy, and the killing of 40,000 people in Gaza. The suspension of some arms contracts, could he explain what effect that will actually make on Israel's ability to continue the bombardment of Gaza, or will it continue unabated? And will he also explain what role, legally or otherwise, Britain has played in overflying Gaza with surveillance aircraft and the use of RAF Akrotiri as a staging point for aircraft going to Israel, which many people believe are carrying weapons that are used to bomb Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman is informed on many aspects of these issues. He must know that our exports to Israel amount to about 1%. And in fact, it is the United States and Germany and others that are much more engaged in the selling of arms to Israel. So when he asks me the effect, he can draw his own conclusions in relation to that. I am very comfortable with the support that we give to Israel, and I won't comment on operational issues as he would expect from this dispatch box.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Israeli military F-16 aircraft have dropped thousands of bombs on civilians in Gaza in the last 11 months. UN weapons inspectors confirmed that this includes bombing the premises of aid agencies, Medical Aid for Palestinians and the International Rescue Committee, which housed Palestinian aid workers, international aid workers and doctors in January of this year. F-16s have further killed thousands of Palestinian civilians who had fled their homes to what the Israeli military had designated a safe zone in Al-Mawasi. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary if he will confirm that this arms ban will include licences related to the F-16 and that this is in service, if so, of upholding UK and international law and protecting civilian lives? Can I also express extreme concern at the ongoing Israeli military action in the West Bank? Earlier this year, I was in Tulkarem refugee camp after a military raid, and last year, Jenin refugee camp, days after a military raid, both much smaller than what is happening now. The West Bank and Jerusalem are at boiling point alongside the horrors in Gaza. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary, what action is he taking to uphold international law there as well?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, of course, my honourable friend brings tremendous expertise to this House on the issues on the ground, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank. Can I reassure her that we have fully assessed the export licensing regime and those weapons that might be used in the conflict, and that includes those she mentions, have been excluded. She's quite right to raise the issues of deconfliction, the aid workers who have lost their lives, and I want to reassure her that I have raised these issues with the Prime Minister himself in Israel and with other members of the government, and pressed them hard on these issues. And I know, frankly, in coming into this role, that the former Foreign Secretary did exactly the same. And therefore it's on that basis in many ways that we sadly and regrettably have come to the assessment that I've had to today.
Mike Martin.
So we've had some very strong words from the Foreign Secretary today about how this war must end, and we've also heard words about how important it is that we have a ceasefire to do so, and I take him at his word. But looking forward, what levers does he have, and when is he going to pull them?
The Honourable Gentleman's new to this House, so I tread very gently. But I would urge him to reflect that in the end, to bring about peace, as we saw in Northern Ireland, you need partners for peace. And the principal partners here are Benjamin Netanyahu and Sinwar. And the deal that we have on the table can bring about that peace. And I have to tell him, in the last 8 or 9 weeks in office, I have spent more time on this issue than any other issue pressing to get that ceasefire.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've seen the most serious incursions into the West Bank for 20 years, and that's under cover of the horror that is happening in Gaza, otherwise it would be leading the news. And towns like Jenin completely cut off, the water supply, the streets ploughed up in that way. What's the government's specific response to this, which is really a form of collective punishment? And has the Foreign Secretary looked at whether arms and equipment are being used specifically in the West Bank?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to my very good friend that the UK position is clear. Settlements are completely unacceptable and illegal under international law. They present an obstacle to peace and they threaten the physical viability of a two-state solution. That is why we take this so seriously, and it's why we condemn the settler violence and incitement remarks, such as those that were made by Israel's National Security Minister Ben Gvir and the Finance Minister Smodrick. All of these issues we keep under review, and all of these issues I'm discussing with our closest allies.
Ben Lake.
Speaker, amid the devastation of bombardment and the collapse in civilian infrastructure, civilians in Gaza must now contend with polio. As has already been mentioned this afternoon, to be effective, the UN vaccination programme needs to attain some 90% population coverage. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary for his assessment of the initial progress of the scheme and what steps his government is taking to help facilitate a swift and hopefully effective rollout?
Well done.
Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to the question, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's horrendous that polio has returned after 2 decades of absence in Gaza. That is why we convened and pressed to get this pause, to get these children vaccinated in Gaza, so that we can not see a new flowering of that horrendous disease and affliction. And I hope he will commend the leadership that we've shown and the leadership we saw in the UN Security Council to bring about this vaccination programme in the last few days.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are all desperate to see an end to the suffering on all sides in this conflict. The Iranian regime and its proxies are one of the biggest barriers to ending that conflict and achieving a sustainable ceasefire. Will the Secretary of State agree with me that tackling the threat from Iran is vital, and will he update us on his plans to prescribe the IRGC?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful for the question, and I would not want the House to lose sight of the further sanctions that I've announced of the 4 individuals in the House this afternoon, and you can revisit the statement just to be abreast of that. He's absolutely right about the dangers that the IRGC poses, and indeed it's been important for me in these early weeks in office to engage with my Iranian counterpart and to urge de-escalation, particularly in relation to any action that Iran is contemplating. This remains the very, very biggest and most important of issues for us here in the UK. It is absolutely right to keep it centre stage.
Ellie Chans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The news of suspension of some export licences is indeed welcome, and I know there are many in my constituency across the country who will be glad to hear this. But I'm alarmed that it seems that the principle underpinning criterion 2C is being inconsistently applied here, and in particular the justification that the Foreign Secretary has offered for not suspending licences for the F-35 appears inconsistent. There does appear to be clear evidence of clear risk. There are online posts, I understand, from the IDF indicating that F-35s have been used in bombing Gaza. And so I'd like to urge the Secretary of State to review this case again and to suspend those licences. Can I ask him also, please, to clarify whether licensing continues for R902W Wankel engines, because they were involved in the World Central Kitchen attack on humanitarian workers? Thank you.
The Honourable Lady asked important questions around the F-35, and it is important for me to state that in looking at the F-35, it's important to understand that there is a global supply chain. She will recognise threats, very, very serious threats that exist across much of the globe in other terrible theatres of conflict. I think were she in my situation, she too would make the judgment that we should do nothing to equip those who would cause tremendous harm in relation to this decision. And that's why it has been important, never mind the ability to actually distinguish across that multiple supply chain that involves many nations, those particular equipments that those particular bits of armoury that she's talking about.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The children of Gaza have faced an onslaught from above and now the spread of disease. And I would just like to ask that the Foreign Secretary of State considers once again bringing those who are most vulnerable to the UK for medical treatment. Polio has a lasting impact and could need a lot more support for people if they've already been infected with lifelong disabilities. We've also got children who have need amputations and life-altering operations that they haven't been able to access the right quality of care because hospitals have just not been there. Can we look at this again? Other countries are doing it. Let us be part of it.
Foreign Secretary.
My honourable friend raises a very important issue, and that is why I and the member for Oxford East made the statements in our first weeks in office in relation to supporting UK Med and restoring the funding to UNRWA to ensure that those children get the medical aid that they need at this time. Now, I'm afraid my assessment is across Gaza, it's not sufficient for the reasons that I've discussed. But it was important that we put all the aid and money we could to that endeavour, particularly on behalf of those young children. And there's another issue that I'm tremendously concerned about. It's the amount of young people not in school. This has gone on for months, and young people must be in school.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his answers? I defend the right of Israel to protect all of its people, the same as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland did for its own citizens against IRA terrorism, and as Ukraine has done against Russian aggression, ever mindful of that. So our hearts ache with those hostage families who have received the news that they have feared and dreaded for almost a year, and even more forcibly underlines the need to ensure that either the hostages or their remains are brought home, and that steps can be taken for peace in the Middle East, which is all of our goal. I know it's the Minister's goal, it's the goal of everyone in this House. Will the Minister outline what further steps that can be taken along with our allies to bring this peace, this much needed peace, about? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I just say to the honourable gentleman that today's decision relates to an independent process in relation to, of course, to our strategic export licensing criteria. It comes on yet another day of tremendous pain for those hostage families, and I'm acutely aware of that. And it's why I've sought to speak to those families, of course those who have a relationship with our own country, but those beyond as well, and to meet with those families when I've been in Israel. my heart bleeds for them. The pain and the suffering that they're going through is torturous. That there are so many left is unbelievable. And to have gone so many months not knowing whether your loved one is alive or dead is horrific. And anyone who looks at the front pages of the international news and looks at those beautiful young people who have been taken from us in the most horrific of ways, frankly, it brings tears to the eyes. And I feel so much, I offer my deepest condolences, and all of us do, to those families who've learnt they'd lost their loved ones over the last few days.
Apsana Begum.
The Foreign Secretary announced 30 of approximately 350 export arms licenses will now be suspended. That is still less than 10% of the total number of export arms licenses to Israel. Given that over 40,000 Palestinians have now been killed, given that Israel is expanding its military operations in the occupied West Bank, and given that a former Foreign Office official resigned, stating, and I quote, that it is actually quite clear that Israel is perpetuating war crimes in plain sight, will the UK government ensure that the UK is not complicit in Israel's war crimes and suspend all arms sales to Israel?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I've followed the quasi-legal process that we have in this country. We've got one of the most robust regimes in the world. I stand by the decision that I've made that approximately 30 export licenses to Israel should be suspended at this time. And yes, it does represent 10% because it's the 10% that could be used in the theatre of conflict that we're concerned with. But I would also just gently say to the Honourable Lady that there are many things that we might sell that I don't think anyone would suggest, a helmet or goggles, we shouldn't be selling to one of our closest allies. And so you make that assessment in a measured way, in a sober way, on behalf of the British people, and I'm satisfied with the assessment that's been made.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Foreign Secretary's decision to withdraw some of the arms, or the licenses to arms? I'm confident, even though our arms trade is insignificant, it's bound to have a repercussion on other countries that provide arms licenses. So I certainly welcome that. But what steps can the Foreign Secretary do in liaising with his Israeli counterparts in relation to the Palestinian children which are now going to receive vaccinations for polio, and they're being moved from pillar to post without a real safe zone? Will the Foreign Secretary seek assurances that they will be given a safe zone and not blown away after giving their polio vaccinations?
Foreign Secretary.
Yes.
Catherine Frooks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Foreign Secretary, for your statement. I absolutely share your pain, your horror and your dismay at the number of innocent civilians killed in Gaza. I received a letter from constituents under the banner of Families for a Ceasefire recently, signed by over 70 families in Monmouthshire, calling for a ceasefire and a ban on all arms sales to Israel. So I welcome the suspension of the 30 arms licences, but could my right honourable friend share with us when the further review of the remaining licences will be available, and also look at encouraging other countries around the world to do as we have done and suspend their licences to Israel? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I recognise that this is a really big issue for her constituents, and I recall being in Wales a few months ago and this being raised with both of us as an issue when I was in opposition and speaking on behalf of the opposition benches. Our regime is our regime. Different countries will have different arrangements, and it is for them democratically to determine those arrangements, and they will have made a range of different assessments. And she'll also understand that, as I said, there are really only 2 or 3 countries that sell substantial amounts to Israel, and we are not one of them, in truth. The assessment that has been reached, regrettably, today I think should satisfy all those who've been concerned with any breaches of international humanitarian law on the basis of a clear risk, which is the export licensing criteria. As I said in my statement, it is not a judgment. It is not for me or the government or any of us in this place to act as judge and jury. That is a matter for the appropriate international courts and must be determined in the usual way. And so I just emphasise it's the clear risk judgment on our export licence regime that has required me to make this judgment.
Chris Murray.
Thank you. I welcome the government's statement today, and I know that many of my constituency will as well. Our overwhelming priority must be an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that both sides must come to a table to end this conflict, and will the Foreign Office strain every diplomatic sinew to effect it?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, yes, I say to my honourable friend, we need a ceasefire now, and it is in the hands of the major actors here to bring that about and get those hostages out, get that hostage deal. And so many families in Israel want to see that hostage deal and bring the suffering of the Palestinian people to an end so that the aid can get in the quantities that's required. It's within our reach. I had hoped, I'll be honest with him, I had hoped that we would have reached that point by now. But we must still reach to get there over the coming days.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've been talking about polio today because tragically we've learned about how this infectious disease is taking a grip in Gaza with the tragic diagnosis that we've had. However, there are many commutable diseases within Gaza which are spreading, and therefore just focusing on polio will not be sufficient to save lives. What further steps can he take to ensure that those windows of vaccination, of treatment, and for bringing cure can be extended so more life can be saved?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising these issues. Can I assure her that myself and my colleague, the member for Oxford East, are on these issues, that our support for all medical aid in Gaza is paramount, and that sitting alongside the medical context, of course, is the nutrition context and the threat of famine and starvation, particularly, that leads to so many medical ailments. So she's right to emphasise these issues, and I can only say to her that we continue to work, particularly, the UK particularly works on this front.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary rightly said in his statement that famine is looming ever larger in Gaza and, of course, just mentioned the issue of hunger and malnutrition. Yet the World Food Programme has only managed to bring in half the aid needed and indeed recently suspended movements of its staff after they came under attack. Can the Foreign Secretary expand on the assessment of hunger and malnutrition levels in Gaza and the specific action that the government is taking to push for unimpeded access to food aid?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising this issue. It is of tremendous concern that over the last few days the World Food Programme have suspended their activities in Gaza because their own workers have come under attack for the issues of deconfliction that has been raised already in this House, given the tremendous concern across the House about nutrition, about starvation, and about famine. We will be redoubling our efforts over the coming days and working with international partners to see that people do not go without the food that would keep them from the famine status.
Matthew Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's call for an immediate ceasefire. That's the route for hostages to be returned home and for aid to flow into all corners of Gaza. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's call for a two-state solution, the only route to a lasting peace in the region. I also welcome the clarity that there is no moral equivalence between the Israeli government and the heinous action and intent of Hamas. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary what steps can be taken to stop or stem the flow of money and aid and weapons from Iran to its proxies who are so determined to bring about Israel's total destruction?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the tone of the honourable gentleman's remarks. He's absolutely right to put the spotlight on Iran, and it's why I've announced further sanctions today. It's why we keep the position of the IRGC under close review. It's why I've spoken to the Iranians twice in the last few weeks and urged de-escalation. It's why also I've been to Lebanon and met with the Prime Minister, the Speaker and others, and those who could get messages to Hezbollah. We have amongst the very best military intelligence capability in the world, working with our partners. These are issues of utmost importance in relation to global security.
That concludes that statement, and before we move on to the next statement, we'll let the front benches change over. Before I call the Home Secretary to make her statement, I will remind the House that several hundred people have been charged with criminal offences relating to these disturbances. Most of these cases are still before the courts. Public order is a matter of national importance, and I am therefore granting a limited waiver to the House's sub judice resolution in the following terms. Members may make statements of fact about the circumstances of the unrest, about the number of people arrested, charged and sentenced, and about the kinds of behaviour exhibited during these events. However, they may not refer to specific individuals who have been charged and are awaiting trial, or engage in any discussion or speculation about individual cases. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I start, I want to pass our sympathies to the families of Sher Maximan and Musi Mnetu, who died sadly this weekend following violent incidents around Notting Hill Carnival. And our thoughts are with their friends and families at this terrible time, and our thanks go to the police who moved swiftly to charge suspects in both cases. There is no place for such appalling, senseless violence on our streets, and this government is determined to stamp out the scourge of serious violence wherever it is found. With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will now make a statement on the violent disorder that occurred earlier this summer. Just before the parliamentary recess, I made a statement to this House on the horrendous attack that took place in Southport on the 29th of July. 5 weeks on, our hearts still ache for the 3 precious little girls who lost their lives, for their loved ones, and for the other children who were injured or endured unspeakable horror that day. The House will know that a suspect has been charged and the investigation into the attack is ongoing. Those grieving families, the Southport community and the country will need answers, but for that reason the legal process must now take its course. That day in the House, all of us came together in sorrow and in solidarity with the families and with the people of Southport. And I spoke of the bravery, the compassion and the distress of the police, the paramedics and the firefighters that I had met that morning who were first on the scene. So it is truly appalling that within hours of that statement, those same Southport police were facing the most disgraceful, violent attacks from criminals and thugs. Police officers pelted with bricks and bottles, the local mosque, a place of worship, subjected to violent attack. And while millions of decent people across the country were praying for bereaved families, a criminal minority of thugs and extremists saw only an opportunity to hijack a town's grief. The Merseyside Chief Constable Serena Kennedy spoke at the funeral of Alice da Silva Aguiar, and she said she hoped that anyone taking part in the violent disorder was hanging their head in shame at the pain that they had caused the bereaved family. In the days that followed, we saw further disgraceful violent disorder in a number of towns and cities, repeated attacks on the very police officers whose job it is to keep communities safe, over 100 officers injured. In Sunderland, a citizens' advice branch set alight. In Liverpool, a library and vital community hub was torched. In Hull, shops were looted and a mosque was targeted. In Rotherham, a hotel used as asylum accommodation was set alight when people were inside. In Bolton, clashes between rival groups involved fireworks and bottles thrown. And we saw people targeted on the streets because of the colour of their skin. This disgraceful disorder and racist hatred, including that whipped up by a hateful minority online, was an insult to those grieving over Southport. So let us be very clear, those violent and criminal attacks were not protests, they were not about grievance, they were thuggery, racism and crime. Plenty of people across the country have strong views about crime, about policing, about immigration, asylum, the NHS and more, but they don't pick up bricks and throw them at the police. They don't loot shops or attack places of worship, and they don't set buildings alight knowing that other human beings are inside. There's lots to debate on all kinds of policy issues, but no one should make excuses for violence or thuggery that risks public safety. This was brazen criminality perpetrated in many cases by those with existing criminal convictions. The Prime Minister and I made clear that criminals would pay the price for their violence, and we meant it. The Prime Minister announced a new National Violent Disorder Programme to bring together the best policing capabilities and enhance intelligence sharing across forces. And ministers worked daily with the police and criminal justice partners to ensure that there was a strong and determined response. The National Police Coordination Centre operated a national mobilisation plan to ensure strategic reserves of public order officers were ready to be deployed in support of different police forces. Over 40,000 officer shifts were worked by public order officers over 10 days, with over 6,600 public order officers deployed on one day alone. Rest days were cancelled, additional hours were worked. The Crown Prosecution Service deployed over 100 additional prosecutors, boosting their 24-hour charging service with additional advice from the Director of Public Prosecutions so they could move swiftly to charge. The Ministry of Justice accelerated the work on new cells to bring 500 more prison places on stream earlier, and the Lord Chancellor made clear that the courts stood ready to hear all the cases coming through. And the Home Office established new rapid procedure for security support for mosques to ensure that communities felt supported and felt safe. In total, around 1,280 people have been arrested, around 800 charges have been made, and over 570 individuals have been brought before the courts for offences like violent disorder, assaults on emergency workers, arson, and for encouraging violent attacks online. This robust and swift response from government and the criminal justice system has provided a strong deterrent and showed our steadfast determination to keep people safe. And most importantly, order was restored. But I want now to just update the House on some of the next steps we will take. First, we will take forward positive policing reform to build on the important work done by the National Police Coordination Centre this summer. I want particularly to thank the Chair of the National Police Chiefs Council and Public Order Lead for the mobilisation work that they did. But the reality is that the coordination infrastructure and systems that they had to work with were too weak. And I'm therefore asking His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services to work quickly with the NPCC, the College of Policing and National Lead for Public Order to review the lessons from this summer's events so we can ensure strong coordination intelligence systems are in place and that there is sufficient public order policing for the future. Second, as well as ensuring there's proper punishment for those responsible for the disorder, we'll be pressing forward at pace with this government's mission to take back the safety of our streets and restore respect for the police and rule of law. We will put thousands more neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs back on the streets, reversing the collapse in community policing and rebuilding the relationship between local communities and forces. And this government is very clear. Wherever and whenever violence and disorder emerges, whether in Hartlepool or Hare Hills, Sunderland or Stoke, we expect crimes to face consequences and perpetrators to face the full force of the law. And the criminal violence we saw after the Southport attacks was not the only violent disorder this summer. We also saw disgraceful arson and attacks on the police in Hare Hills. In that case too, 32 people have been arrested, and in the last week, 3 men have pled guilty for arson and violent disorder after a bus was set alight. But third, I've been concerned for a long time not enough is being done to counter extremism, including both Islamist extremism and far-right extremism, as there's been no proper strategy in place since 2015. I have ordered a rapid review of extremism to ensure we have the strongest possible response to poisonous ideologies that corrode community cohesion and fray the fabric of our democracy. And alongside that, the Deputy Prime Minister is overseeing cross-government work to consider how we support our communities and address issues of cohesion in the longer term. Fourth, the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology will strengthen the requirements for social media companies to take responsibility for the poison proliferated on their platforms with the rollout of the measures in the Online Safety Act, and we will continue to be clear that criminal content online results in criminal sanctions offline. And fifth, we stand ready to support the police through the Special Grant for Policing, and the Home Office will work with police and crime commissioners to ensure that the Riot Compensation Act works effectively in the areas that are affected. Madam Deputy Speaker, the country recoiled in horror at the scenes of violence and disorder in some cities and towns earlier in this summer. But let there be no doubt, the minority of criminal and thugs who sought to cause havoc do not represent Britain. Instead, across the country, we saw decent people coming together to support each other, to clean up the damage, to rebuild communities. The bricklayers who repaired the wall of the Southport Mosque, the residents who donated funds and books to restock the Spellow Library, the volunteers in Sunderland who found a new site to offer community advice, and there are so many more examples. And those small, unassuming acts of selflessness should serve as a message to the criminals and extremists that they do not speak for Britain and they never will. Yeah. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary James Cleverly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for an advanced copy of her statements. And I wish once again to pay my respects to the victims of the Southport attacks. The murder of 3 young girls in Southport was horrific, and our thoughts are with them, their families, their friends, and of course the local community. My thoughts are also with the families and friends of those who were killed at the Notting Hill Carnival. The government and Mayor of London must do more to end the criminality and violence which too regularly mars this event, and they must bring forward credible plans to improve the safety of this well ahead of next year's carnivals. I pay tribute to the bravery of our police officers across the country who put themselves in harm's way to deal with the violence perpetrated by thugs this summer. There is not and can never be any excuse, justification or rationale for the violent disorder that we have seen. We cannot and will not let rioting thugs or extremists win. The government must always back our police officers to do what is necessary to maintain law and order, and attacks on the police by any group must not be tolerated. And intimidation of the public or the media cannot be allowed. So does the Home Secretary now see that the comments made by one of her own ministers at the time of the riots, seemingly making excuses for armed thugs intimidating the media, undermines the government's credibility, reinforces the accusations of bias, and puts people, including police officers, at increased risk? And does she now also recognise that the Labour leadership kneeling in the immediate aftermath of the Black Lives Matter disorder, when violent protesters attacked police officers, looks like her party takes some forms of violence less seriously than other forms of violence. And does she accept that any perception whatsoever of treating the same crimes differently based on the race, religion or community of the perpetrators increases tension rather than reduces it? And does she accept that at times of heightened tension, government ministers must be and must seem to be even-handed and demand even-handedness of others? Does she also recognise that the delay in holding a COBRA meeting until almost a week after these events started was a mistake? That it created a vacuum and delayed the actions which could have brought this disorder to an end more quickly? At the time of the disorder, the Prime Minister claimed he would create, and I quote, a standing army of public order police officers. What progress has been made in the intervening weeks to make that claim a reality? After the murder of the 3 young girls in Southport, the Right Honourable Lady and I discussed across the dispatch box the impact of misinformation and disinformation online. When I was Home Secretary, I travelled to the United States to deliver this message directly to the leadership of the tech firms and make
House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound.
Introduced by the Conservative government when I was on her side of the House, to ensure that the police are able to take firm action and clamp down on crime with all the force that the law allows, without the fear of being strung up for years in endless investigations. In government, we recruited 20,000 new police officers, but they will be hampered in their work if they do not feel supported by the government when they take the firm action needed to keep the people of this country safe. Violence has absolutely no place on our streets. Anyone who engages in violent disorder or commits violent crimes must face the full force of the law, no matter who they are. And we will continue to hold the government to account to ensure that they deal with disorder swiftly, effectively, fairly, and even-handedly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, look, I welcome, obviously, the Shadow Home Secretary's words of support for the Southport families and his reassertion that there can be no excuse for violent disorder. But I have to say, the rest of his response sounded an awful lot more like a pitch to Tory party members in the middle of a leadership election than it did a serious response to the scale of the disorder that we saw and the need for a serious policing response. So he asked the issue around the strategic reserve. He asked about the standing army. We set up the strategic reserve. It was in place for the second weekend, and we had thousands of police officers who were ready, not the old arrangements that he used to, that we inherited from him, where mutual aid was had to be on call and had to be stood up in a rush when it was called for, but we actually got the police public order officers ready and deployed at strategic locations around the country so that they could move fast in order to be able to be there when they were needed. And this really goes to the heart of the problems that we inherited from the Home Secretary, the Shadow Home Secretary, and from my predecessor. The central coordination that he had left in place was far too weak. The officers, the chief officers who were involved in trying to get mutual aid in place, trying to coordinate intelligence, had very weak infrastructure, very weak systems in place. They hadn't been supported over very, very many years. In fact, some of his predecessors had tried to get rid of a lot of the work of the National Policing Coordination Centre. So our approach instead is to say that we should strengthen it. We believe that we should strengthen that coordination and we should strengthen the central coordination. We will work with the police to do so, and that is why I have asked the Inspectorate to operate. Secondly, he refers the issues around, seriously, I mean, on social media, the action against social media, his party delayed the Online Safety Act for years, year after year. My colleague, the Secretary of State for Science and Technology, has already been working closely to put more pressure onto the social media companies, but his party did nothing for years. It is far too late for them to try and call for action. The policing use of force review is important and will continue. But I have to say to him finally, this issue about he is playing all these games, undermining the credibility of the police, trying to blame the Prime Minister for something that happened 4 years ago. He's somehow responsible for the violent disorder on our streets this summer, and also undermining the credibility of police officers who take an oath. Each individual officer takes an oath to operate without fear or favour. And I would just remind him, his predecessor, the previous Home Secretary, was the one who first tried to undermine and attack the credibility of the police in the run-up to Armistice Day, and that is why we then ended up with a bunch of thugs trying to get to the cenotaph to disrupt the service and launching violent attacks on the police. That's the only reason he got the job of Home Secretary in the first place, because everyone condemned his predecessor for her behaviour. I'm so sorry that he's decided in a leadership election to follow her example rather than something that I really thought he was better than.
Andy Slaughter.
What a surprise. Can I compliment the Home Secretary and the Lord Chancellor on the robust response that the whole criminal justice system took to the recent riots and violent disorder? But was she, like me, concerned about the number of very young people who have been taking part, pre-teen in some cases? What does she think is the solution, both to rehabilitation and preventing in the future young people of that age becoming involved in this disgraceful behaviour?
My honourable friend makes a really important point about the number of young people involved. Some of those who were involved had a string of convictions, a string of past history, but there were also young people who were drawn into violence and disorder, sometimes in antisocial behaviour and looting of shops, sometimes into serious violence as well. And I think there is an important issue about how we prevent young people getting drawn into violence and antisocial behaviour. It's one of the reasons we are so determined to set up the Young Futures programme. It's also one of the reasons that I think we need to look at online radicalisation of young people as well as part of the extremism review.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for advancing to the statement and associate myself and my party with her comments and her praise for the bravery and professionalism of the police and the other emergency services that we saw throughout these disgraceful episodes. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think this is a moment for everyone in this House to make it clear which side they are on. It's